Hello and welcome to the Space News Commercial Space Transformer series, where we aim to give you a behind-the-scenes look at the people and companies driving the space industry's commercial transformation. I'm Jason Rainbow, senior staff writer at Space News, and today I'll be talking to Sunil Nagaraj, a Silicon Valley venture capitalist who's invested in space startups since the early days of new space. He's also the founder and managing director of Ubiquity Ventures, an early-stage venture capital firm with almost $200 million of assets under management. Sunil, great to have you here. I'm looking forward to hearing your insights on space investments and how the industry is evolving.
Of course, yeah. Thanks, Jason, for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so of course, you were an early investor in space startups about a decade ago, notably Rocket Lab and Spire Global. What initially drew you to the sector, and how did you assess the risk in the early days of new space?
That's a great question. So this was when I was at my old VC firm, Bessemer, in 2010, I think, a year before I joined, Bessemer had invested in Skybox. And I would say that was a smart investment, but it was done without a broad thesis on the whole sector on space. So when I joined in 2011, I participated a little bit in Skybox board meetings. I love space. I've loved astronomy and space for a while. So I had a lot of context about some of the physics and things like that, but not about the space industry as well, the commercial space industry. So in 2014, Google purchased Skybox for $500 million, and that catalyzed within Bessemer and for the investment team there that we should actually devote time and energy into it. So I raised my hand, my hand shot up and said, I'm happy to run with this. It's a very new investment area for VCs, and I know a lot. I was totally wrong in terms of I knew how Saturn's rings works and cosmology and the orbital physics of planets, but I didn't know LOX kerosene or FCC slots or things like that. So I picked that stuff up relatively quickly, dove in, met hundreds of space startups, and it was in the fall of 2014, Peter Beck showed up in our office. He had raised a round from Khosla prior, and now he had built a 3D printed engine, not the whole engine, sort of composed of different 3D components. And he brought it into our office. He had done a test of the engine, just a cold flow test to make sure that everything was flowing properly, and came into our office and said, listen, we need a new set of launch vehicles that are tailored to this new smaller form factor. The Peapod and the CubeSat standard at Cal Poly and stuff was a few years old, and it started to be embraced by the industry. We had seen firsthand at Skybox with the 100-kilogram satellite that it was relatively hard to have predictable launches when you were doing rideshare. So all of this culminated into us making our first, I would say, on-purpose space investment at Bessemer, and that was Rocket Lab. We did it in I think it was November 2014. If you are interested, Bessemer chose to make the full investment memo public, so you can read it. I've done a few blog posts about it afterwards, but in retrospect, we wired the money maybe 2 weeks after the explosion of the Antares rocket at Wallops and a SpaceX explosion. So they had both happened, and these things happen,
Wow.
but it was kind of a funny time to dive in with the new launch vehicle. So that was sort of the play-by-play. But more generally, we had seen at Bessemer, and I still believe this to be true, that many of the characteristics that make software and tech investing interesting had started to come to the space sector. And that means lower cost experimentation. That means buyers who want to buy finished products as opposed to sign a development contract to sort of figure it out over time, and the ecosystem of downstream and upstream investors. So you could stack, you could raise a seed, raise a Series A, and set up milestones in the 12 to 24 months time frame. And so as rigid as it is, VC needs those things to be in place, where you can see a development path, you're reducing risk, you have future capital, and you can do it without billions of dollars. You could do it with hundreds of millions or tens of millions. In the case of Rocket Lab, these numbers are fuzzy, but I think we made it to orbit successfully with under $100 million. Maybe it was even $50 million spent. I mean, it's a shocking number, and it really harkens to the idea that space was becoming a bit more software-like.
So how has the investment scene for space startups changed since then? Are investors today more or less willing to take big risks in new areas?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's been a bit of a pendulum.
Mhm.
So in 2014, 2015, 2016, probably around the time we met, I was speaking at all the space industry conferences saying VCs should come. I was speaking at the tech conferences saying tech should look at VCs. I think the title of one of my talks was Why Tech VCs Are Flocking to Space. And I was trying to really catalyze a lot of interest in this category altruistically and selfishly, right? I wanted more VCs participating in this area. And what I find in venture capital is folks can repeat truisms. Oh, you never make money in space, or oh, it's a hard area, or I hate to put down, our fearless space leader Elon Musk, but when he says space is hard, is so destructive and it scares away entrepreneurs
Mm.
and investors. So I was on stage saying, no, space is easy. I think I would say you can launch a satellite for as much as it costs to launch an app. So kind of catalyzing more interest to bring more VCs. That along with seeing some exits in the area, seeing more activity, more VCs came into the sector. And then at some point, maybe too many VCs, too many investors came into the sector. When I say pendulum swinging, and that culminated with the 2021 SPAC craze.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, that was a pretty big mistake for the industry, heating up too much. And then you saw many folks kind of back off of the sector. The folks who were space curious, the new VCs dipping their toe in, said, no, see, I knew I was right. See, I knew Iridium failed in the 90s and went bankrupt. Didn't fail, sorry, went bankrupt. It lost money. I knew I was right. And so we need to kind of watch the pendulum go back and forth. As of today, I guess February 2025, I think folks are really interested in the space sector. Interest is back. It's layered on with defense tech interest and more of when you look at like the SDA and some government procurement starting to look more like arm's length software purchasing as opposed to long-term contract development, then I think that also makes it interesting for startups because they compete on merit of their finished goods. And so I think interest is at a good level right now. I don't think it's overheated, but it's also not as low as it was in 2014, 2015.
Oh, right. And your firm, Ubiquity Ventures, focuses on software beyond the screen. Could you elaborate on what that means, how that applies to the space industry, and what kinds of space startups fit your investment strategy right now?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. Software beyond the screen are my favorite four words in the English language. It's kind of my night and day, my life is this premise that I think Rocket Lab was one of the first companies that turned me on to that software is really powerful. We can build it really quickly. It's flexible, updatable, changeable. We know that on computers, right? We get updates to Zoom, we get updates to Angry Birds and Facebook app. That can now come to the real world, the real physical world, the chair you're sitting on. What if it had the ability to have the three components I think of: settings, analytics, and updates? You could change something about your Zoom program today. You can turn on the blur on and off. Zoom, the company, gets analytics, knowing how you're using their product, and Zoom, the company, can push an update to you. To me, that's beautiful. It's amazing. It's the future of how customers and creators can be in a continuous loop of improvement together. Again, that's not how a chair works that you sit on. So this is what I think of the nerd description of software beyond the screen. More practically, the focus is on solving real-world physical problems by using software that's jumping off a computer, landing in the real physical world. Several of my investments have it land on space assets. Another one of my Ubiquity investments puts it onto cows. Another one puts it into cars. Another one puts it in your ears. Another one puts it onto plants. So Ubiquity Ventures is so named because this is about ubiquitous software. But the reason this ties back to space, going back to Peter Beck at Rocket Lab in 2014, he had the world's first electric turbo pump, which sounds, I mean, it makes no sense to someone not in the industry. For those in the industry, you'll know that everything else is gas-fed turbo pumps that are mechanical, beautiful devices. Think of like a fancy watch with gear teeth. And Peter's rocket, on the other hand, he could change the compression ratio or the thrust or the speed by changing a line of C++. And this is the essence of software beyond the screen, is that whereas we used to modify atoms, we can now modify electrons. We used to take a month or a year for a cycle to change something. Now we do it in like 5 minutes. And so hence, I mentioned earlier, maybe 50 or 100 million to get to orbit with a working payload orbital class rocket. That's crazy to think about because usually it's 10 billion. And that's because a lot of Peter Beck's work was working in software and iterating software. And I don't mean SolidWorks. I mean like the actual software running on the rocket was updatable and improvable. So I think that's a big deal. All the 40 Ubiquity companies I have a really strong embrace of that idea of updatability, including my two space companies I have today.
Yeah, and of course, AI is becoming a huge part of space technology, from satellite operations to data analysis. Are there any AI-driven space startups that really stand out for you at the moment?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think both Loft Orbital and Muon Space have elements of AI. Loft Orbital's business is to help other customers use space, often by attaching your payload to our satellites, the same way you would upload your code to an AWS server. When you do that with Amazon Web Services, you don't know where it's running. You don't really care. You don't care how it's air conditioned or where the internet comes from, but you care that it happens. Same thing with Loft Orbital. You send the payload. We vibrate, thermal, launch it, certify it, and downlink your data for you. So you get to use space without having to know very much about space. So this is an important piece of the puzzle, and AI slots in very elegantly, largely because you can think about AI 2, 3 years ago is recognizing things. Today, it's a bit more about making decisions. And with the physical distance, the link budgets, the pass windows, the intermittent access, AI really unlocks the ability for better utilization of space because your space assets can make decisions and do things even when you're not in touch, even when you're not overhead. So that usually manifests as tipping and queuing autonomously or task development or downlinking less imagery because you do a pre-screen of the data using AI on board. So there's 3 or 4 really low-hanging fruit and very useful tasks that AI is tailored for. And I'm seeing it show up even on some loft orbital payloads as well as startups that are pitching me. But I think there's a lot more to be done. It's just such a natural environment. Non-radiation hardened like Jetson Nano can still provide tons of value. It could make a satellite 10 times more valuable. And I mean that number. A $5 million asset could be worth 50 million if you could optimize your 12-minute pass window when you're downlinking to KSAT, that you're sending the right bits as opposed to all the bits and then sort of being bottlenecked on transfer, or figuring out where to point, where to zoom in, as opposed to doing just push broom and gathering everything you can. Or, I mean, there's just so many possibilities, but it really just brings some intelligence and speeds up the iteration loop. Just like software beyond the screen does, AI can play a major role.
Wonderful. And for those watching, keen to learn more about Loft Orbital's AI in space plans, we did an episode with Loft Orbital's Alex Greenberg recently, so look out for that. Okay, back onto the investment landscape then, which I know very much part of your day-to-day. What are the biggest challenges space startups face when trying to raise venture capital today?
Yeah.
And any key advice for founders looking to secure investment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I see a pretty common issue with space startups, and that is actually a issue across all startups, but definitely deep tech startups, which deep tech includes many other more technical areas. And I would summarize it as there's a spectrum between look what I can do versus look who cares. And it turns out in deep tech, it's very hard to do these things. You have to be skilled. It takes energy. You have expertise, training. And so it's very natural to pitch a company saying, look what I can do. Look how hard this is. It takes all this energy. I've achieved 6 gigawatts, or I've achieved this altitude, right? As opposed to the other end of the spectrum is, it doesn't matter how it works. Look how happy they are, right? How much these customers want it, right? And it's a very jarring transition. And the founders I back and the ones that are most successful, even Peter Beck in 2014, when he pitched this the first time, he said, look, this will enable blah, 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 blah. He didn't, only when I asked as a nerd, I asked how exactly does the electric turbopump work? He went into it. But up until then, it's about the impact, it's about the customer interest. So in a lot of the space pitches, I think tilting them more towards the eventual impact and who cares would be great. Avoiding the word imagine if, right? That's also sort of theoretical, and that is tricky for mainstream investors and even space investors. It sort of requires 2 or 3 hops. It's a theoretical concern versus I've talked to 5 real people, and they said if I were able to offer 1 kilobit of data connectivity to any field in the country, they would be interested, right? That changes everything. And then we can talk about how you achieve the 1 kilobit of data connectivity. So that transition is a critical one. Then there's the idea of and this is kind of endemic to communication comms versus observation. With many of the comms companies that pitch me, and because they're deep in the solution as opposed to the impact, they think, well, yeah, I can put up something, but you really got to have 20 of these birds up, and that requires 200 million. So will you invest 200 million? It turns out nobody will invest 200 million off the bat. And it is a tricky thing because if it's important comms, it needs to be persistent, meaning you need to sort of transition from one to the other. So you need to launch all at once. And all at once is generally not a VC fundable concept anywhere. Today in 2025, the way venture capital works is you take a little step, you de-risk a lot of stuff. You take another step, and each of these steps is called a financing round. So you would raise money from your own bank account or friends, make a little progress, and then raise money from a seed venture capital firm, make a little progress. And within comms, as traditionally defined, it's very hard to do that. So if there is something in communications, I think it's interesting to find hacks or quirks or tricks to get around this all or nothing. And some of the companies I've heard of do store and forward, and they start with Arctic field stations and transmit a little bit of data before they eventually offer ubiquitous constant connectivity. Yes, Elon has the capital to be able to do it all at once, Starlink all at once, but most people won't have that availability. So that's comms. In EO, or Earth observation, or taking pictures. There, it is a bit more amenable to just like, let's put up one, let's get pictures, and you can start revenue, you can prove customer interest, then launch a second one. So it's less of the all at once. There are elements of like, well, we need to have pervasive observability all the time. Might have to go to geo for that, or might have to put up a few birds, but it's not quite as bad. So those are the two big things. Like, look what I can do versus look who cares, and then tailoring your launch plan. I mean, the rollout plan, so that you don't have an all at once kind of element to your financing.
Thank you for detailing that. That's very useful. So on the flip side, then, if you were to launch a, let's say, pure play space-focused VC fund today, what areas would you prioritize for investment and why?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think in general, there's the categorization of space stuff has to do with sort of the chronology of a space mission. There's terrestrial, on the ground, satellite manufacturing, buses, things like that. There's launch vehicles. There's satellites themselves once they're in orbit, whether that's for Earth observation, communications, navigation. And then there's infrastructure for those satellites, whether that's trusses or tethers or backhaul internet connectivity, refueling, and then back on the ground, the communication with um, communication networks, downlink networks, or downstream processing, like Orbital Insight or something like that, making sense of the data. So there's this natural spectrum where I think it would be interesting. I think to have a space-focused VC firm, you'd have to think about touching all of those. I don't know that there'd be um, um, enough opportunity in just one of those to just go super deep with the whole venture capital firm. I mean, most VC firms might make 10 or 20 investments over 3 or 4 years. So it's hard for me to imagine just doing launch, or just doing materials, or just doing downlink. So I think you play with all those areas. I think they're all very interesting. I think the trick is to avoid getting pulled into the hype, and it's to find bets that fit well with the size of the fund you're doing. Where if it's a seed fund, my latest fund is $75 million. I write $1, $2, $3 million checks. That's tailored to a certain size of opportunity and a certain amount of capital intensity, and so you don't want to get over your skis on that. But at the moment, I think there's a ton of opportunity around applying, like as you mentioned, AI to do more autonomous tasking and thinking in space, data reduction, crunching, pulling out the insights. So I think the stage is set for us to shift from look what I can do versus look who cares. There's a lot of people who will care once the output of space is packaged properly. So I think making it relevant for the right set of folks on the ground opens you up to very large markets. There's still some opportunity in your company selling to space markets themselves, whether that be solar panels or ground comms or something like that. But a lot of areas I wouldn't, I'm not smart enough to sort of pick my favorite or pick the most lucrative right now, but I think there's enough and the space is not overheated. So I think it'd be a crazy idea.
Good stuff. Sunil, thanks again for taking the time to chat. It's been great hearing your insights on space and investments in the industry and where it could be heading. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Jason. It's great being here.